By 1900, the mansions along London Road looked out over Lake Superior, and Duluth, Minnesota, made a claim that would outlive most of the men who made it. More millionaires per capita than any city in America. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, just this. A shipping town at the edge of a young continent, insisting it held more concentrated fortune per head than anywhere else. The commercial club promoted the number. The governor of Minnesota repeated it in 1906. Nobody could prove it. A national count in 1892 found 4 millionaires in the city. A later estimate in 1902 guessed at 8, possibly 10, never independently verified. No national ranking of millionaires per capita existed to check the claim against, which did not stop roughly 20 other American towns from making the identical boast. Today, Duluth has about 87,000 people, and its harbor ships less cargo than it has in nearly a century. The mansions on London Road are still standing. It was a city that built an empire, and then built a myth about the empire that outlived it. Chapter 1. The Head of the Lakes. Duluth sits at the westernmost point of the Great Lakes, at the head of Lake Superior, where a chain of inland seas reaches as far into North America as a lake that size can reach. The harbor sits 2,342 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, North America's farthest inland seaport. And the distance is not a curiosity. It is the reason the city exists at all. Nothing else about the location recommended it. The winters were long, the growing season short, the ground better suited to rock than to farming. What the site had was position, and in the second half of the 19th century, position was worth more than soil. Iron ore torn from the ground to the west, timber cut from the forests to the north, prairie grain grown across a young continent's northwest. All of it, everything a growing nation dug, cut, or grew in that quarter of itself, had to funnel through this one harbor to reach an ocean-going ship. Not a fortunate location. The only location. Duluth did not build a fortune. Geography handed it one. People understood the value of this Narrows long before anyone called it Duluth. The Ojibwe of the Fond du Lac Band lived at the mouth of the St. Louis River, at the harbor's western edge, and they had a name for the place, Nahgachiwanong, at the far end of the Great Lake. It was a description, not a boast. This was the end of the lake, the last navigable water before the interior took over. And whoever controlled the Narrows controlled the seam between two different worlds, the water route east, the portage route west. The city's name came later, and it came from a Frenchman. Daniel Greysolon, Sieur Duluth, reached the head of the lake in 1679, working the edge of a trade network that stretched from Quebec into country no European had mapped. He did not stay long. Explorers rarely did in that country, in that century, at the edge of a map still mostly blank. He is remembered less for what he found than for what he prevented that year. A peace, brokered between the Ojibwe and the Dakota, two nations whose territories met at the same Narrows he had just crossed. The city that eventually rose at that Narrows kept his name. It did not always keep his gift for peace. The peace with the Dakota held longer than the peace with Superior, Wisconsin. In 1871, work crews cut a channel through Minnesota Point, the long sand spit that had always separated Duluth's harbor from the open lake, connecting the bay directly to the shipping lanes and giving Duluth its own entrance onto Lake Superior. The city of Superior, sitting across the bay, and built on the assumption that ships would keep coming through its own channel, did not take the news well. Superior's lawyers went to federal court and won an injunction ordering the canal work stopped. The injunction arrived after the channel was already cut. By the time the paperwork caught up with the shovels, the advantage had already shifted, and Duluth had the entrance. 2 ports on one bay, and only one of them controlled the water. Over that canal, the city eventually built the structure that would outlast every millionaire's mansion on the hill above it. An aerial ferry first carried traffic across the gap in 1905. It was rebuilt as a vertical lift bridge in 1929 and again in 1930. The same channel, the same sandbar, a new steel span in its place. It became, in time, the image people reached for when they needed to picture Duluth at all. Not the mansions, not the mills, a bridge over a ditch, and the ditch was the point. Everything the city would become, every fortune it would advertise, and every fortune it would actually make still had to pass beneath that bridge to reach the lake, long after the docks around it began to go quiet. The harbor was the funnel. It still is. Chapter 2. The Gamble. A funnel is only a shape until someone puts money through it. Duluth had the geography. What it needed was a believer, someone willing to bet real capital on a piece of shoreline and call it a future. It found one in 1869, in a Philadelphia banker who had financed the Union War effort and was now looking for the next place to put that fortune to work. J. Cook bet on Duluth as a rail and shipping gateway to the entire Northwest, a raw settlement at the head of the lake with nothing yet to recommend it but geography and Cook's own confidence. It was not a modest bet, and it was not made quietly. He backed the city's first grain elevator in 1869, the structure that would let the wheat of a young continent pour down through the harbor instead of stopping at the edge of the plains, sacks and bushels, becoming cargo the moment they touched Duluth soil. He financed the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad, the line meant to carry that wheat and the timber, and eventually the ore, down to the docks his money was already betting on. The railroad reached Duluth on the 1st of August, 1870. For the first time, the funnel had a reason to believe it might actually work. Cook had financed the war. Cook had financed the elevator. Cook had financed, without quite meaning to, the entire premise the city was now standing on. For 3 years, that premise held. The elevator filled. The rail line ran. Lots along the hillside sold to men who had never seen Duluth and did not intend to, buying on the strength of Cook's name alone. And then, quietly, the premise came apart. On the 18th of September, 1873, J. Cook and Company went bankrupt. The failure of one Philadelphia banking house does not sound, on its own, like the kind of event that could erase a frontier settlement on the far side of the continent. But Cook's collapse triggered the panic of 1873, a financial contagion that closed banks and stalled railroads across the country within days. And Duluth had staked its short existence entirely on the credit and construction economy the panic was now dismantling. There was no dam to break, no fire to watch, nothing dramatic enough to name. There was only a telegram from Philadelphia, and then the slow, unglamorous work of a town coming apart at the seams it had never finished sewing. The city that Cook's money had built emptied out nearly as fast as it had filled. The lots stopped selling. The rail line kept running, but with less to carry. Duluth's population fell from roughly 4,500 to around 3,000, and the men who had arrived believing they stood at the edge of a fortune found themselves standing instead at the edge of someone else's bankruptcy. The recovery was slow, and its arithmetic was humbling. In 1877, Duluth reverted to village status, unable to carry the debts the boom years had left behind, and refinanced what it owed at 25 cents on the dollar. A settlement that priced, with brutal precision, exactly how much of the original promise had survived. It would be a decade before the town earned back the standing it had lost. Duluth was not reincorporated as a city again until 1887. Cook never lived on the shore he had bet on. His money had arrived from Philadelphia, and when it failed, the failure arrived from Philadelphia too. The first instance of a pattern the harbor would see again and again in the decades ahead. Other names would follow his richer names names attached to steel and iron and railroads instead of war bonds, and each of them would repeat the same arrangement Cook had set in place without meaning to. The fortune would be made at the head of the lake. The decisions that made it and the decisions that ruined it would keep arriving from somewhere else, signed by men who had never stood on the docks they were gambling with. The village went back to waiting. There, Chapter 3, The Ore. What ended the waiting was not a banker, and it was not a railroad. It was the ground. Timber came first. Mills at the head of the lake had been cutting Minnesota's North Woods for years, but by 1890 the operation had grown to a scale the village of the 1870s would not have recognized. Duluth area mills cut 150 million board feet that year alone. Pine floated and hauled down to the harbor, milled at the water's edge, loaded onto ships bound east through the canal J. Cook's railroad had made worth cutting. Real tonnage. Moving through a village that 20 years earlier had nearly emptied out. In 1891, the Mitchell and McClure sawmill opened on the waterfront and claimed to be the largest sawmill in the world. Not the largest in Minnesota, not the largest on the lake, the largest anywhere. By 1902, the mills of the Twin Ports were cutting 443 million board feet in a single year, the peak of an industry that had spent 3 decades converting a forest into a harbor's income. It could not last because a forest is not a mine. It does not refill itself while you work it. The timber played out through the 1910s and into the 1920s, and the mills that had once claimed to be the largest in the world simply ran out of trees. But the timber had only ever been the surface crop. Underneath it, north of it, waiting the way the harbor itself had once waited, was iron. Not a rumor of iron, not a prospector's story told over a fire, but 2 ranges of it, one already earning, one still buried. The Vermilion Range, northeast of the city, shipped its first ore in 1884, mined the way iron had always been mined, blasted, shafted, hauled up hard rock at hard cost. The Mesabi Range was not found until 1890, and what it offered was not a variation on that method. It was an end run around it. The ore lying under the Mesabi was soft hematite, red and loose, and so pure it could almost be lifted straight out of the earth, not blasted, not mined, in the old sense of the word, just dug. The Mesabi shipped its first ore in 1892, and the men who dug it out did not need dynamite so much as a shovel and a place to put the ore once it came up. The men who opened the Mesabi were not a company. They were a family, 4 brothers and 3 of their sons, prospectors who had worked the country north of Duluth long before anyone thought to look underneath it. They called themselves the 7 Iron Men, a name a family gives itself when no one else has given it one yet, and for a few years the range seemed to agree with them. Other men had crossed the same ground before them and seen only rock and swamp. The Merritts had looked down instead of across. They staked it. They dug it. They shipped it. The ore was, for a while, theirs in every sense that mattered. And then, in 1893, the same kind of shock that had ended Duluth's first boom came around again. A national panic. Credit gone within weeks, not just for the Merritts, but for every enterprise in the country that had built ahead of its cash. Caught short in the panic of 1893, the Merritts did what men caught short by other men's capital have always eventually done. They merged with John D. Rockefeller. Then, they sold to him. The fortune coming up out of the Mesabi's soft red ground was, by every measure that could be counted, a Duluth fortune. Found by Duluth men, dug from Duluth area soil, weighed on Duluth's own docks before it ever left on a boat. But the decision about who would own it was already being made somewhere else, the way it had been made somewhere else once before. J. Cook had taught the town that lesson in 1873. The Merritts were learning it now. 7 men had found the greatest iron range in America. 4 brothers, 3 sons, a name of their own choosing. They were already losing it. Chapter 4. The Fortune That Left. Alfred Merritt did not accept the loss quietly. The family had opened the Mesabi, and within 3 years of opening it, had been forced by the panic of 1893 to sign it over, piece by piece, to the one financier the panic had made stronger rather than weaker, John D. Rockefeller. In 1895, Merritt sued him for fraud, arguing that the financing arrangement, which swallowed the family's stake in the range, had been built on deception from the outset, that the men who found the ore had been maneuvered out of it by the man who bankrolled them. The case went before a Duluth jury, a hometown jury, drawn from the same streets that had watched 7 men open the greatest iron range in America and then watched them lose it within a decade. The jury believed Alfred Merritt. It awarded him $940,000, a hometown verdict for a hometown grievance. The verdict did not survive appeal. A higher court set it aside, and after further legal maneuvering, the Merritts settled for $525,000, a little more than half of what the Duluth jury had thought their claim was worth, and a fraction of what the range itself was worth. The men who had walked the Mesabi's soft red hills before anyone else understood what lay beneath them ended their fight for it with a signature and a check cashed. The range now belonged, entirely and permanently, to somebody else. The scale of what had actually left the state became clear 6 years later. In 1901, United States Steel was formed, and Rockefeller sold his Mesabi holdings into the new company for $80 million. $80 million set against the Merritts' $525,000. Set the two figures beside each other, and the settlement stops looking like compensation and starts looking like a rounding error attached to somebody else's fortune. The price of an apology, not the price of a range. None of that $80 million came back to Duluth. It did not build a mill on the waterfront or a family fortune passed down through 3 generations of Merritts, or anything at all that a person walking London Road in 1901 could have pointed to and called their own. It went to Rockefeller, already among the richest men alive. It went to Morgan. It went to Carnegie. 3 names that needed the money considerably less than the city that had dug it out of the ground. The range stayed in Minnesota, fixed to the earth, unmovable. The fortune it produced did not stay anywhere near it. This is where the boast belongs. Not at the start of the story, where it is easiest to admire, but here, at the moment, the ore's real owners stopped living anywhere near the ore. The commercial club had been building its claim of a city thick with millionaires in these very years, and the governor repeated it as settled fact in 1906. The count of 4 from 1892, the 8 or 10 claimed a decade later, a figure no one could prove and no one much tried to. The absence of any national ranking to measure the number against, the roughly 20 other American towns making the identical claim about themselves, all of it thickened precisely as ownership of Duluth's own iron passed permanently into hands that lived 1,000 miles east. The timing was not incidental. A city inflated a story about its own wealth in the very years its actual wealth was being counted out in a courtroom it did not win, in a settlement it could not enforce, in a boardroom in New York it had no seat in a ledger it never got to read. Duluth could not keep the fortune the range had made. It kept a story about the fortune instead, repeated it, printed it, put it in a governor's mouth. The myth would outlive the empire. Chapter 5. The Mansions on London Road. Not all of the money left. Some of it stayed in Duluth, in a strip of shoreline running northeast out of downtown where fortunes made in ore and timber, and the businesses adjacent to both went looking for a place to be seen. Along London Road and through the East End rose Glensheen, the Cotton Mansion, and the Dudley Mansion, houses built to face the water and to be seen from the street, evidence that the city's wealth, however it left the range, had at least paused here long enough to build something. It was not a large district. 3 houses in the end, that history remembers by name. But it was built of brick and lake stone, not of press releases, and it was real in a way the Millionaire boast never quite managed to be. Picture London Road on an evening in 1908. Lake Superior lies flat and gray to the east, holding the last light longer than the streets behind it do. Glensheen's windows come on room by room as the evening settles, and further along the road the Cotton Mansion and the Dudley Mansion catch the same low light off the water. Below the bluff, out past the harbor entrance, the running lights of the oarboats move slowly toward open water, carrying the freight that paid for all of it. There is no oar dust up here, no whistle, no rail yard noise, only the wind coming off the lake and the particular quiet of a street built by men who had already made their money somewhere else and brought it home to look at. It is the kind of quiet that has to be paid for. It was a street built to look permanent. Not all of what built it would be. Chester Congdon was an attorney, not a miner. He had represented the Oliver Mining Company, U.S. Steel's mining arm on the Mesabi, and he used the position the way a good attorney uses a position, to see the range from the inside and buy accordingly. Congdon bought cheap Mesabi land and leased it to U.S. Steel for a royalty on every ton that came out of the ground, so that the more the company mined, the more he was paid. He had not swung a pick. He had not raised a shaft. He had not staked a company's future on a claim the way the Merritts had, and lost it. He signed a lease, and the lease made him one of the richest men in Minnesota. He went into politics the way he went into mining, without touching the ground himself. Congdon served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1909 to 1913, elected chiefly to fight a proposed tax on iron ore, a tax that would have reached his own royalty income along with everyone else's. He did not run on roads or schools or the harbor. He ran on the ore tax and spent his term in St. Paul defending an income he had never had to dig. He was a legislator defending a ledger. Congdon built his estate between 1905 and 1908 on 12 acres of Lake Superior shore and named it Glensheen. It cost roughly $850,000 and held 39 rooms. Keep Glensheen in mind. It comes back twice more, and only one of those times has anything to do with iron ore. Downtown rose to match the district above it. The Allworth Building went up in 1910, designed by the Chicago firm of D.H. Burnham and Company, 16 stories that would stand as the tallest building in Duluth for more than a century. The Duluth Union Depot, completed in 1892, served 7 railroads under one roof. Traffic a smaller city would have needed a whole district to hold. Anger Tower, a gift to the city from an immigrant furniture dealer, was dedicated in 1939 by the Crown Prince of Norway. An ocean away from wherever its donor had started. A skyline, a depot, and a tower on a hill. None of it mined, none of it dug, all of it paid for by money that had already come out of the ground somewhere else. The tower still stands above the harbor. Chapter 6. The Company Town. By 1901, the pattern had a name, even if nobody in Duluth used it out loud. Rockefeller had taken his share of the Mesabi and gone. Morgan had taken his share and gone. Carnegie had taken his share and gone. What stayed behind before that year was a lawyer's royalty check, Congdon's mansion, built on percentages, not on ore. Then in 1901, the largest of the outside owners did something none of the others had done. United States Steel, formed that year as the first billion-dollar corporation in American history, decided to come to Duluth in person and to build. It needed a deal first. Minnesota had spent 2 decades watching its iron leave the state raw, unprocessed, the royalties paid to men who lived in New York and Cleveland, the same grievance that had sent Congdon to the state legislature to fight a proposed tax on ore. The state now offered U.S. Steel the mirror image of that fight: build an integrated mill on Minnesota ground, and the ore moving through it would be taxed lighter than the ore that simply passed through on its way to somebody else's furnace. Duluth got an industry that would finally keep some of the iron. It got that industry by agreeing to tax the iron less. Congdon had fought the same tax from inside the legislature, on his own account, and won a version of the same trade. The state, a few years later, made the identical trade at industrial scale and called it economic development. Construction rose along the St. Louis River through 1913 and 1914. The Duluth Works, U.S. Steel called it, a fully integrated plant, ore going in at one end and finished steel coming out the other, on a scale Lake Superior had never hosted. The ore that had flowed out to Rockefeller, out to Morgan, out to Carnegie, now had somewhere to stop on its way through, at least in part, at least for a while. The plant cost $45 million to build. On the 11th of December, 1915, the furnaces were lit and the first steel was poured. Beside the plant, the corporation built a town. It went up in 1913, laid out with curved streets instead of a grid, and brick homes instead of frame shacks, its own school, its own hospital, its own company stores. In 1914, U.S. Steel gave it a name, Morgan Park, for J.P. Morgan, the New York banker behind the corporation, who had, by any account, never once set foot in it. A town owned by a company named for a banker, built to house the men who poured the company's steel. It was the outside owner pattern made physical. The same money that had shipped Duluth's ore to New York for 20 years now stood on the ground itself, with a street grid and a payroll and a sign at the entrance bearing another man's name. The bank in New York had finally sent something back besides a check. It had sent a town and kept the deed. The city grew under all of it, and it grew in the plainest way a city can be measured. In 1880, Duluth counted 3,483 people. By 1960, it counted 106,884. The sources differ by a few hundred, depending on who was counting and when, but not by much more than that. Every decade in between had added docks, added blocks of workers' housing climbing the hillside above the harbor, added another shift at the Duluth Works, and another row of company homes at Morgan Park. The harbor grew to match the ore and the population both. In 1953 alone, the Duluth Superior Port moved roughly 77 million tons of cargo, ore, grain, coal, through the same canal cut through Minnesota Point back when Duluth was barely a village at all. By sheer tonnage, each orange, it was now one of the busiest ports in the country. That was the peak, arriving all at once and from every direction. The Duluth Works ran at full capacity. Morgan Park's homes were full, its school and its hospital staffed and running. The harbor was as busy as it would ever be, and the city, at 106,884 people counted in 1960, was as large as it would ever be. The number would not be reached again. Chapter 7. The ore runs out. By the 1950s, the ore that had built all of it was running out. The high-grade Mesabi hematite, the soft ore that could almost be shoveled straight from the ground, had underwritten the docks, the mansions, the company town, the harbor that once moved 77 million tons of cargo in a single year. By the 1950s, it was largely gone, mined down to the rock beneath it. What remained was taconite, a low-grade ore, hard and stubborn, that had to be blasted, crushed, concentrated, and rolled into pellets before any furnace could use it at all. The industry adapted around the new rock rather than around the old city. New processing plants rose at Silver Bay in 1955 and at Hoyt Lakes in 1957, engineered from the foundation up to handle pellets instead of raw ore. In 1964, a taconite amendment to the state constitution locked in the tax terms that made the investment worth making. The rock had changed. The law had changed to match it. The soft ore that had funded Glen Sheen and the Allworth building and the docks along the harbor was not coming back. Whatever the new plants could process, it was not that. The plant at the center of Duluth had not changed with either of them. U.S. Steel's Duluth Works was still running open hearth furnaces of a kind competitors elsewhere had spent years replacing, and modernizing a plant built for the ore of 1915 would have cost more than $100 million. The company weighed the number and chose not to spend it. Duluth had built an empire on ore that could be shoveled from the ground by hand. The ore that replaced it required machinery, capital, and plants sited wherever the economics favored them, and none of those plants needed to sit beside a 50-year-old mill on the St. Louis River. Taconite could be pelletized somewhere else, shipped somewhere else, finished somewhere else. There was no version of the ledger in which the old plant was worth saving. The closing came the way the ore itself had always come off the Mesabi, in stages, not all at once. The hot side of the Duluth Works shut down in 1971. The cold side shut down in 1973. The coke plant shut down in 1979. By 1981, the corporate presence that had anchored the city for 80 years was gone entirely, and with it went some 2,700 jobs. The plant that had poured its first steel on a December morning in 1915 is now a federal Superfund site, monitored rather than operated, fenced rather than worked. The city emptied out with the plant. Duluth had reached 106,884 people in 1960, the number that would not be reached again. By 1990, it held 85,493, a fall of about 20% in 30 years, and the mill was not the only thing leaving. In 1982, the Geno's frozen food plant packed up for Ohio and took 1,200 jobs with it. That same year, the Air Force Base closed and took roughly 1,400 more. Two announcements, 1 year, 2,600 jobs, and neither one had anything to do with iron ore directly. Both were about a regional economy the iron ore had built and then stopped supporting. By 1982, the Duluth Superior Metro carried an unemployment rate of 19.5%, worse than nearly every metro area in the country, second in the nation only to Youngstown, Ohio, another city built on furnaces that had gone cold. Glen Sheen was still there through all of it, the same 39 rooms on the same 12 acres of Lake Superior shoreline that Chester Congdon had built at the height of the boom, decades before any of this decline had a name. In 1977, the Gilded Age that had built the house produced one last headline. On the night of June 26th and into the morning of June 27th, Elizabeth Congdon, Chester's daughter, then 83 years old, was murdered inside the house, along with her night nurse, Velma Pietola. The heiress's son-in-law, Roger Caldwell, was convicted of the killings. The mansion built to display one family's fortune, in the same years the city around it was losing its jobs and its people, produced its darkest headline instead. The plant was gone. The jobs were gone. Glen Sheen was still standing exactly where Chester Congdon had built it. It was famous now for a different reason. Chapter 8. What Remains. Duluth today holds 86,697 people, according to the 2020 census, a shade under the 87,000 the city rounds up to, and the first sustained population gain it has recorded in decades. Not a boom, not a recovery, in any sense the word would have carried in 1900, when the commercial club was still counting millionaires instead of residents. just a line on a chart that had been falling since 1960, finally bending the other way. And even now, the city holds barely more than 3/4 of the 106,884 people counted at its peak. The harbor still moves cargo through the channel cut into Minnesota Point in 1871. The same Channel Superior's lawyers once got an injunction against a few weeks too late. The port still ships taconite. The port still ships grain. The port ships less of each than it has in decades. The tonnage down to its lowest levels in almost a century. The grain trade down to its lowest level since 1890, the year the mills at the head of the lake were still cutting pine, and the Mesabi had not yet been found under anyone's feet. Glensheen is still standing on its 12 acres of shoreline, and it has not belonged to the Congdon family for a long time. Chester Congdon's heirs gave the estate to the University of Minnesota Duluth in 1968. It opened to the public as a museum in 1979, 2 years after Elizabeth Congdon and her night nurse were murdered inside it, and it is today the most visited historic house museum in the state of Minnesota, toured by most accounts as much for the murders as for the Millionaire. Of everything the Gilded Age built along London Road, this is the one fortune that survived whole. 39 rooms, held intact, sold back to the public a ticket at a time, in the same city whose larger fortune had gotten up and left for New York and Cleveland 3/4 of a century earlier and never come back. The Millionaire count could never be verified. The house can be walked through for the price of admission, and every year more people do. The city built a smaller economy out of what stayed behind. Canal Park, the strip of shoreline below the lift bridge that had spent decades as little more than a junkyard of rail spurs and idle warehouses, now draws well over 1 million visitors a year. Essentia Health, a hospital system, became the largest employer in a city that once measured its payroll in tons of ore and pounds of steel. Cirrus Aircraft arrived in 1994 and now builds small planes on the edge of the old Iron City, on ground that never shipped a pound of taconite in its life. Tourists, nurses, machinists building airplanes instead of ore cars. None of it moves through the harbor the way the ore once did, and none of it needs to. The harbor is still where the story ends, because the harbor is where it began. Of the 6 great ore docks Duluth once operated along its waterfront, only 2 are still standing. One of them still loads taconite around the clock, its gantries running day and night the way they have run since ore first started moving through this channel. Its twin, Dock Number 5, has stood idle since 1985. The same pilings, the same rust-streaked steel, rising out of the same gray water a half-mile down the shore. Built the same years, by the same company, for the same purpose, and now one side works and one side simply waits. Ore cars once ran the length of both docks, and grain and iron once moved down both chutes into the holds of boats bound for furnaces the city never got to name. Now only one chute still drops. The lights burn at one end of the dock. The other end sits dark and has sat dark for 4 decades. Rust working down through the same steel that once carried a fortune out of the state and never carried a fraction of it back. The water underneath does not know the difference. It still runs out through the canal, past the bridge toward the open lake, carrying whatever the city still has left to send through it. The harbor was the funnel. It still is, narrower now, and half of it standing idle, but still the only way out.